Hey there, night wanderers. Welcome to The Sleepy Activist, where we uncover the hidden stories of resistance, solidarity, and collective power that changed the world one restful night at a time. Tonight, we're settling into the coldest nights imaginable. Medieval winters during the Little Ice Age, when temperatures dropped so low that rivers froze solid for months, when snow fell in June, when entire harvests failed and famine stalked the land. We're huddling by dim fires in drafty cottages, trying to survive until spring with families who faced cold that would kill us in hours. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy easing into sleep through stories like this. Drop a comment below and let us know where and when you're watching. Are you warm in bed with central heating keeping you comfortable? Listening while wrapped in blankets you take for granted? Or maybe you're somewhere far away, understanding too well what it means to struggle against the cold. Tonight's story isn't about knights and castles or the romance of medieval life. It's about ordinary peasant families barely surviving the harshest winters in European history. About children who died from cold and hunger. About communities that shared what little they had to keep everyone alive. It's about human resilience in the face of climate catastrophe, about the collective strategies that allowed people to endure conditions we can barely imagine. So let your breathing slow, let your muscles relax, and let's travel back to 1315, to a small village in northern England at the beginning of the Great Famine, where a peasant woman named Margery is about to experience the coldest, hungriest winter of the deadliest decade in medieval history. Margery is 32 years old in the autumn of 1315, which makes her almost elderly by medieval peasant standards. She's survived childhood diseases, multiple pregnancies, decades of hard labor, and the constant threat of starvation that defines peasant life. She lives with her husband Walter, their 4 surviving children, aged 3 to 12, Walter's elderly mother, and during winter, their most valuable possession, a cow, who shares their one-room cottage because the animal's body heat helps keep everyone alive. The year 1315 marks the beginning of what historians will call the Great Famine, a 7-year period of catastrophic crop failures, mass starvation, and social breakdown. But it's also part of the larger Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that began around 1300 and will last until the mid-1800s, bringing the coldest winters Europe has experienced since the last ice age. Margery doesn't know about climate change or the Little Ice Age. She knows only that the weather has been wrong for years now. Summers are shorter and cooler. Spring comes late and ends early. The harvest season is compressed, leaving little margin for error. And winters have become something terrible, lasting from October to April. Brutal in their intensity, deadly in their duration. The cottage Margery and her family inhabit is typical of peasant housing in 1315. It's a single room, perhaps 15 feet by 20 feet, with walls made of wattle and daub, woven sticks covered with a mixture of mud, dung, and straw. The roof is thatched with reeds or straw, constantly needing repair as it rots and leaks. There's one door and perhaps one small window with a wooden shutter, but no glass. Glass is for wealthy churches and manor houses, not for peasants. The floor is packed earth, perpetually damp and muddy. There's a central hearth for cooking and heating, but no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let smoke escape, which it does poorly, leaving everyone with chronically irritated eyes and lungs. The furniture consists of a rough wooden table, a few stools, straw mattresses on the ground, and some shelves for the few possessions they own. This cottage is supposed to shelter 7 people and a cow through 6 months of brutal winter. It's inadequate in ways we can hardly imagine. Heat from the hearth fire barely reaches the walls. Drafts blow through gaps in the wattle and daub. Moisture from breath, cooking, and the cow creates a perpetually damp atmosphere. Ice forms on the inside walls during the worst cold snaps. The smoke from the fire has no proper escape route, so the air is constantly thick and choking. The harvest of 1315 has been catastrophic. The previous winter was unusually long and harsh. Spring came late, and when it did come, it brought constant rain. Cold rain that prevented proper planting, that drowned seeds in waterlogged fields, that created conditions for crop diseases and pests. Summer was cool and wet. The grain that did grow rotted in the fields. The harvest, when it finally came in September, yielded perhaps 40% of a normal year. This means Margery's family, who barely survive in good years, face winter with less than half their normal food supply. The grain they harvested must feed them and their livestock, provide seed for next year's planting, and pay their obligations to the Lord who owns the land they farm. After the Lord takes his share and the church takes its tithe, Margery's family is left with perhaps 4 months' worth of food to last through a 6-month winter. The shortage is not unique to Margery's family. It's universal across Northern Europe. This means there's no surplus anywhere, no reserves to draw on, no possibility of buying or trading for additional food. The entire system that normally redistributes resources during local shortages has broken down because the shortage is everywhere simultaneously. As October arrives and the first hard frosts kill the last garden vegetables, Margery begins implementing survival strategies that peasant families have developed over generations of food insecurity. She dries and preserves everything edible. She makes soups stretched with water to make limited food last longer. She begins rationing, giving the largest portions to Walter, who does the heaviest physical labor, and to the oldest child who can work, while she and the younger children eat less. The cow, absolutely essential to survival, must be kept alive through winter. Margery feeds her the last of the hay, supplemented with straw from the roof thatch, with bark stripped from trees, with anything remotely digestible. The cow's milk, even in reduced quantities, is the difference between survival and starvation for the children. But if the cow dies, the family loses milk, loses the calf she might produce in spring, loses the possibility of selling her if things get desperate. By November, the real cold arrives. Temperatures drop well below freezing and stay there for days, then weeks. Snow falls and doesn't melt. The world becomes a landscape of white and grey, beautiful and deadly.
The first challenge of medieval winter is heat. Modern people, accustomed to thermostats and central heating, cannot really comprehend what it means to be cold, truly, dangerously, perpetually cold for 6 months straight. Margery wakes before dawn every morning, as she has her entire life. But in winter, this means waking in complete darkness, with no heating except what remains of the banked fire from the night before. The temperature inside the cottage might be only a few degrees above freezing. Her breath makes clouds. The water in the bucket has a skin of ice. Getting out from under the pile of blankets and straw that provides inadequate insulation feels like stepping into a frozen river. Her first task is reviving the fire. She keeps the hearth fire burning constantly through winter, banking it at night with ashes to preserve coals. Letting the fire go completely out would be catastrophic. They have no matches, no easy way to create fire. They would have to borrow fire from a neighbour, which, in a community where everyone is struggling, creates social debt and dependence. Fuel for the fire is a constant anxiety. The village commons include woodland where peasants can gather fallen wood, but not cut live trees. Those belong to the Lord, and taking them is poaching, punishable by fines the family cannot pay or by physical punishment. Competition for fallen wood is intense, with dozens of families combing the same forest for the same limited resources. Margery sends her oldest son, 12-year-old John, and her 8-year-old daughter Alice to gather wood daily, when weather permits. They trudge through snow, sometimes waist-deep, to collect branches, bark, anything burnable. They learn to identify which trees have dead branches that can be broken off, which fallen logs are dry enough to burn well. They compete with neighbours, sometimes coming home with almost nothing after hours of exhausting, freezing work. The firewood they gather is never enough. A fire large enough to keep the cottage tolerably warm would consume more wood than they can possibly gather. So the fire is kept small, just large enough for cooking and to provide a radius of warmth where the family huddles. More than a few feet from the fire, the cold is brutal and unrelenting. Clothing becomes crucial for survival. Margery and her family wear layers of wool, the fortunate outcome of centuries of sheep farming in England. Wool, even when wet, provides insulation. But peasant clothing is crude, simple tunics, leggings, cloaks, all hand-woven from rough wool, undyed, patched and repatched until the original fabric is barely visible. Everyone sleeps in their clothes. Undressing in a freezing cottage would be dangerous. They add layers, multiple tunics, cloaks wrapped tight, cloths wound around heads and hands. The children sleep piled together for warmth. Margery and Walter sleep with the youngest child between them, using their body heat to keep the child from freezing. Even so, they wake frequently through the long winter nights, so cold that sleep is difficult, adding straw to the fire, checking on the children, enduring. The cow, sharing the cottage, provides valuable heat, but also creates problems. The animal's waste accumulates on the earthen floor. The moisture from her breath adds to the damp atmosphere. The smell is overwhelming. But sending her outside would mean her death in temperatures this low, and her death would likely mean the family's death by spring. Food rationing becomes a grim daily calculation. Margery has perhaps 3 pounds of grain per person per week, oats mostly, some barley if they're lucky, wheat only for the lord and the wealthy. She makes this into pottage, a thick porridge or soup that's been the staple of peasant diet for centuries. She adds anything available: dried peas, turnips from the root cellar, herbs, bones for flavour, water to stretch everything as far as possible. The children are hungry constantly. They cry from hunger, asking for more when there is no more. Margery watches them grow thin, their faces becoming gaunt, their energy declining. Childhood hunger during medieval famines is heartbreaking. Children don't understand why there isn't enough food, why they must go to bed hungry, why the adults can't solve this problem. She prioritizes the nursing infant, her youngest at 18 months, still breastfeeding, though Margery's own malnutrition reduces her milk supply. She prioritizes Walter because he must maintain enough strength to work. She prioritizes John because at 12 he can do adult labor and his contribution is essential. She, Alice, and the 6-year-old and 3-year-old eat last and least. This prioritization, cruel as it seems, is a calculated survival strategy developed over generations. If the working adults collapse from malnutrition, everyone dies. If they can keep those doing the most essential work functioning, the family has a chance to survive until spring. It's a strategy that values family unit survival over individual fairness, that makes calculations modern ethics would reject, but that medieval reality demands. By December, the food situation worsens. They're eating into supplies meant for later winter. Margery makes the portions smaller. The pottage becomes thinner, more water and less substance. She scours the forest for anything edible. Bark from certain trees can be ground and added to flour, making it go further, though providing little nutrition. Acorns, normally fed only to pigs, are collected, soaked repeatedly to remove bitter tannins, and ground into a crude flour. The village as a whole is struggling identically. Every family is rationing, every family is competing for limited wild foods, every family is watching its weakest members sicken. The social fabric, normally strong with patterns of mutual aid and community cooperation, begins to strain under the pressure of universal scarcity. Still, cooperation continues in crucial ways. Families share information about where wood can be found, which wild plants might be edible, which animals might be snared for food. They share labor, taking turns watching children so others can forage or gather fuel. They share heat, with multiple families sometimes gathering in the largest cottage to pool fire resources and body heat. The village also maintains grain stores for emergencies, controlled collectively and rationed carefully. But these reserves, adequate for a single bad year or to support a few struggling families, are pathetically inadequate when everyone is struggling simultaneously. The stores are opened in January and distributed, giving each family perhaps an extra week's worth of grain. Helpful, but not enough to solve the fundamental shortage.
By mid-January 1316, the situation is desperate. The cold shows no sign of breaking. Temperatures remain below freezing day and night, with occasional warm spells that bring false hope before plunging back into bitter cold. Snow accumulates in drifts that make travel difficult and dangerous. The village becomes isolated, cut off from the market town, unable to seek help even if help were available. Margery's family is starving slowly. They're still eating, still functioning, but everyone is losing weight, losing strength, losing resistance to cold and disease. The children's hair becomes dull and sparse. Their skin develops sores that won't heal. They're listless and weak, unable to play, sitting by the fire and staring at nothing. Walter develops a cough, common in winter with the smoky, damp living conditions, but in his weakened state, it worsens into something more serious. He struggles to work, to gather wood, to perform the essential labor the family depends on. Margery knows that if Walter becomes truly ill, if he cannot work, they will almost certainly not survive. There is no medical care beyond folk remedies and prayers. The village priest holds special masses to pray for spring, for warmth, for food. The church teaches that suffering is God's will, that the harsh winter and starvation are punishment for sin, that redemption comes through acceptance and prayer. This theology offers little practical comfort to starving children, but it provides a framework for understanding the suffering, a sense that it has meaning, even if that meaning is harsh. In February, the first deaths occur. Old William, who lived with his daughter's family, dies in his sleep, the cold finally overwhelming his elderly body. The death is both tragic and, in a terrible way, practical. One fewer mouth to feed might mean the survival of the others. The village cannot spare labor for elaborate funerals, so William is buried quickly in the frozen ground with minimal ceremony. More deaths follow. An infant in a neighboring cottage dies from a combination of malnutrition and cold. A woman giving birth dies along with her baby. Winter births are dangerous in the best of times, catastrophic during famine. The village's population, perhaps 80 people at harvest time, has dropped by 7 by the end of February. Margery's 3-year-old daughter develops a fever. In summer, with adequate food and warmth, a child might fight off an illness. In winter, starving and cold, the fever is likely a death sentence. Margery does everything she knows, keeps the child near the fire, gives her what little extra food can be spared, makes herbal teas from hoarded supplies. She prays, bargaining with God, promising anything if he will spare her child. The child dies after 3 days of fever. Margery, who has already buried 2 children who died in infancy, adds another small body to the frozen ground behind the church. She cannot afford to grieve properly. She has 3 other children depending on her. A husband who is ill, daily survival tasks that cannot be postponed. She buries the grief as she buried the child, carrying it inside, adding it to the accumulation of losses that define peasant life. This death breaks something in the family. They're not just hungry and cold now, they're bereft, traumatized, facing the real possibility that more will die before spring. The question is no longer, will we have enough food, but who will die and can we save anyone? Margery makes harder calculations. The cow, despite being essential, is eating food that could go to the children. If they slaughter the cow now, the meat might feed them for weeks, might keep everyone alive until spring. But without the cow, they'll have no milk next summer, no calf to sell or raise, no way to recover from this winter. Killing the cow saves the family now, but likely dooms them to destitution later. They decide to keep the cow alive as long as possible, even if that means the family stays hungry. It's a gamble on the future, betting that spring will come, that they'll survive long enough to need the cow's milk and reproductive capacity. But the decision means continued hunger, continued risk. The village as a whole faces similar impossible choices. Some families slaughter their livestock, choosing immediate survival over future prosperity. Others, like Margery's family, try to keep animals alive. Both strategies have logic. Both might fail.
By March, Margery's family is barely surviving on wild foods, supplemented by tiny amounts of remaining grain. They eat tree bark processed into a crude flour. They eat roots dug from under the snow. They make soup from bones that have already been used multiple times, extracting every possible bit of nutrition. They're not alone. Across Northern Europe, millions of peasants are doing the same, surviving on foods normally considered inedible, watching their families waste away. Walter's cough has worsened into what we would recognize as pneumonia, although Margery knows it only as winter sickness. He can barely work, spends most days by the fire, weak and feverish. Without antibiotics, without proper nutrition, without warmth adequate to support recovery, his chances are poor. Margery takes on his work in addition to her own, exhausting herself, racing against time.
In these darkest weeks, the villagers' collective survival strategies become crucial. Medieval peasant communities were not simply collections of independent families. They were tightly integrated social and economic units where individual survival depended on communal cooperation. The village holds an emergency meeting at the church. Every family that can spare a representative attends. They discuss collectively how to survive the remaining weeks until spring. The discussion is frank. They're all starving, all desperate, and if they don't work together, more will die. They decide to pool remaining resources more aggressively. Families with a bit more grain share with families with almost none. Families with healthier members take on work for families where everyone is sick. They organize communal meals for children, where the little remaining food is distributed to ensure the next generation survives, even if some adults don't. This communal support isn't charity, it's mutual insurance. Everyone knows that next year it might be their family in the most desperate position. Everyone knows that the village only survives if enough people survive to maintain essential work. They're binding themselves together for collective survival. They also organize systematic foraging expeditions. Groups of stronger villagers go into the forest together, searching for any possible food source. They're finding things no one would consider food in normal times: lichens scraped from trees, certain fungi, cattail roots from frozen marshes. They share knowledge about what's edible, which wild plants are nutritious versus merely filling. They trap animals when possible, rabbits, birds, anything with meat. But the lord who owns the land claims all game, and poaching is punishable by fines or violence. The villagers are careful, taking only what they must, sharing kills secretly. They're breaking the law to survive, a form of resistance that's both necessary and dangerous. Margery participates in these communal efforts while also caring for Walter and the children. She's exhausted beyond anything she's experienced before, operating on minimal food and minimal sleep, driven by pure determination to keep her family alive. She feels herself weakening, knows she's approaching the limits of human endurance. In late March, signs of potential spring appear. Days gradually lengthen. The sun, when it appears, has slightly more warmth. The snow begins to melt slowly, revealing muddy ground beneath. Birds return, a sign that winter might actually be ending. These signs provide psychological relief, almost more valuable than physical comfort, the knowledge that this hell has an ending, that they might actually survive. But spring is treacherous in 1316. The weather swings wildly between thaw and freeze. Melting snow creates flooding and mud. Fields remain too wet to plough and plant. The hungry gap, the period between when stored food runs out and when new crops become available, stretches longer than usual because of the delayed planting season. Margery's family is now eating less than half what they need. Everyone is weak, barely able to work. Walter is bedridden with his lung illness. The cow miraculously survives and begins producing a small amount of milk again as she can graze on the first spring grass. This milk becomes the primary food source for the children, the only thing keeping them from complete starvation. In April, Walter dies. His lungs, damaged by smoke and disease, finally give out. Margery loses her husband of 14 years, the father of her children, her economic partner. She's now a widow with 3 children, in a society where widows have limited rights and few economic options. But there's no time to grieve properly. She must immediately figure out how to keep the family alive without Walter's labour. The village, recognizing her desperate situation, makes collective decisions to support her. Her eldest son, John, now almost 13, is considered capable of taking on some of Walter's work obligations. Neighbours agree to help with tasks John can't manage alone. The widow's portion of land is maintained, not seized immediately by the lord, as it might be in a harsher manner. This support reflects both community solidarity and practical calculation. If Margery's family completely collapses, the village loses productive capacity, loses the labour that John will provide as he matures, loses the children who might grow to be productive adults. Keeping the family viable serves everyone's interests. By May, the worst is clearly over. Fields are finally drying enough to plough and plant. The first spring greens appear, nettles, dandelions, wild garlic, providing fresh vegetables that taste miraculous after months of starvation diet. Animals have young, lambs, calves, piglets, promising future food. The world is returning to life. Margery's family has survived, but at tremendous cost. Walter is dead. 1 child is dead. The 3 survivors are physically damaged by months of malnutrition. They're undersized, weak, likely to face health problems for years. Margery herself is aged beyond her years, worn down by stress and deprivation. The spring of 1316 brings relief, but not abundance. The planting season is delayed by late cold and excessive moisture. When crops finally go in the ground, they're behind schedule, leaving less time for growth before autumn. Everyone works exhausting hours, trying to compensate with labour for the poor conditions and reduced workforce. Margery, now a widow, faces the challenge of running a household alone. John, at nearly 13, takes on adult male responsibilities, ploughing, planting, maintaining tools and buildings. He's too young for such work, but there's no choice. Alice, at 8, takes on more domestic work, helping Margery with cooking, cleaning, childcare, and managing the garden. The social structure provides some support for widows with children. Margery is not evicted from her cottage. Her land is not immediately seized. John's labour counts toward the family's obligations to the lord, but her position is precarious. If she cannot maintain production, if John falls ill or is injured, the lord could revoke their rights and give the land to someone who can work it. She considers remarrying. In a peasant community, unmarried adults are unusual. Households need both male and female labour to function effectively. There are several widowers in the village, men who lost wives during the winter, who also need partners. But Margery resists, at least for now. She's exhausted by grief and survival, not ready to bind herself to someone new. The harvest of 1316 is poor again. Yields are better than the catastrophic harvest of 1315, but still well below normal. The Great Famine will continue for years. 1317 brings another failed harvest. 1318 is only marginally better. The climate remains unstable, with cold and wet conditions continuing. The Little Ice Age is just beginning and will bring periodic crises for centuries. But Margery's family adapts and survives. They develop better strategies for extreme winters. They preserve food more carefully. They maintain stronger community networks. John grows stronger and more capable. By 1318, though still scarred by the terrible winter of 1315-1316, the family has achieved a fragile stability. The experience teaches lessons that will be passed down through generations. Margery teaches her surviving children what she learned. Never let the fire go out, preserve everything possible, maintain community ties, help neighbors because someday you'll need their help, treat livestock as family because they're essential to survival, prepare for the worst because the worst can happen. These lessons are not unique to Margery's family. They're being learned across Northern Europe by everyone who's survived. The Great Famine becomes a generational trauma, a reference point, a reminder of how quickly things can fall apart and how essential community solidarity is for survival. By the early 1320s, the climate stabilizes somewhat. Harvests improve, the population begins recovering, though it will take decades to return to pre-famine levels. Margery, now in her late 30s, has survived what many did not. She has 3 children alive and healthy, a functioning household, a place in the community. She eventually does remarry to a widower with children of his own, creating a blended household that's common in medieval society, where death is so frequent. The new household is larger, more resilient, better able to handle future crises. John grows to adulthood, takes over the family holding, and eventually establishes his own household. The cycle continues. But the memory of that terrible winter stays with everyone who lived through it. They remain vigilant, always preparing for the possibility that such conditions could return. And they do return periodically throughout the Little Ice Age. The winters of the 1430s bring similar conditions. The 1590s see catastrophic cold and harvest failures. Each generation faces its own version of the crisis Margery survived.
Looking back from our perspective, Margery's story teaches crucial lessons about human survival during climate catastrophe, about the strategies that allow people to endure conditions that would kill us within hours. First, the importance of community. Individual families could not survive extreme winters alone. Only through collective action, sharing resources, pooling labour, mutual support, could enough people survive to maintain the village. This wasn't charity or altruism, but enlightened self-interest, recognition that everyone's survival depended on everyone else's survival. Second, the vulnerability of agricultural societies to climate variation. Medieval peasants lived on the edge of subsistence in good years. Even small climate variations could trigger catastrophe. A growing season shortened by 2 weeks, a cold spring that delayed planting, excessive moisture at harvest. These relatively minor changes cascaded into famine and death. Third, the unequal distribution of suffering. The rich, nobility and church hierarchy largely survived the Great Famine. They had diverse resources, stores of food, the ability to purchase supplies when peasants could not. The famine killed primarily the poor, the vulnerable, those who lived closest to the edge. Climate disasters, then as now, disproportionately harm those least responsible for causing them and least able to survive them. Fourth, the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary conditions. Margery and millions like her survived hell through determination, ingenuity, and collective action. They found food where none seemed to exist. They kept fires burning through months of desperate cold. They made impossible calculations and maintained humanity even in the depths of crisis. Fifth, the long-term impacts of climate catastrophe. The Little Ice Age and the Great Famine helped trigger massive social changes. They contributed to the crisis of feudalism, to peasant rebellions, to questions about the social order. When the system fails to protect people, when lord and church offer no help during crisis, traditional authorities lose legitimacy. The Little Ice Age continued long after Margery's death. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren faced similar crises. The Cold Period contributed to the 100 Years' War, to the Black Death, populations weakened by famine being more vulnerable to disease, to social upheavals across Europe. But communities adapted. They developed better storage techniques, more diverse crops, improved building methods. They learned, generation by generation, how to survive conditions their ancestors hadn't faced. The knowledge Margery passed to her children about preparation, community, resilience, became part of cultural inheritance. From our modern perspective, comfortable with central heating and abundant food, Margery's winter seems impossibly harsh. And it was. Most of us would not survive a single week under those conditions. We lack the physical toughness developed by constant hard labor, the knowledge of survival techniques, the social networks and community structures that made survival possible. But we face our own climate crisis, one that will test our resilience and collective capacity in ways we're only beginning to understand. The Little Ice Age, with its crop failures and social disruptions, was a regional crisis. Climate change now is global, with potential disruptions that dwarf medieval famines. Margery's story reminds us that humans can survive extreme conditions, but only through collective action and mutual aid. It reminds us that climate disasters disproportionately harm the vulnerable. It reminds us that adaptation requires both individual resilience and fundamental social changes. And it reminds us that the knowledge of survival passed down through generations is precious and essential.
As you drift into sleep tonight, warm and comfortable in ways Margery could never imagine, think about her and the millions of medieval peasants who survived winters that would kill most of us within a day. Think about what it meant to be cold, truly, dangerously cold for 6 months, to watch your children go hungry, to bury a child in frozen ground, to make calculations about who eats and who goes without, to maintain humanity and community even when survival demanded everything you had. Margery's winter was made worse by a climate cooling she couldn't control, by a feudal system that took food from starving families, by social structures that provided no safety net. But she survived through collective action, through community solidarity, through the accumulated knowledge of generations about how to endure. We live in a time of climate change, facing disruptions that could trigger crises we've not experienced in modern memory. Margery's story teaches us that survival requires not just individual preparation, but collective solidarity, that disasters hit the vulnerable hardest, that adaptation means fundamental changes in how we organize society. The medieval peasants who survived the Little Ice Age didn't just endure, they passed to future generations the knowledge and social structures that allowed survival. They maintained community when individualism would have meant death. They shared when hoarding seemed rational. They supported the weak, even when resources were scarce. These lessons remain relevant. Climate crisis, then and now, requires collective action, requires mutual aid, requires recognition that we survive together or not at all. Sleep well, night wanderers. Rest in your warm bed, grateful for central heating and abundance. And remember Margery, who huddled in the dark with her dying fire, who buried her husband and child, who survived the coldest winter of the deadliest decade, and who passed to her descendants the knowledge that humans can endure even the harshest conditions when they stand together. Her story isn't boring history. It's a testament to human resilience, to the power of community, to the knowledge that survival in crisis requires collective action and mutual support. Sweet dreams, and remember, we wouldn't last a day in Margery's winter, but we can learn from her survival the lessons we need for our own challenging future. Rest well.